In every anxious-avoidant relationship, there comes a moment when the anxious partner finally breaks down. This breakdown doesn't come with noise, drama, or emotional outbursts, but rather as a quiet yet decisive turning point. It's the moment when protecting one's mental and emotional well-being becomes more important than holding on to love. Among human relationships, perhaps the most complex and tangled dynamic is what experts call the anxious-avoidant dynamic. This is a relationship where one person constantly seeks closeness and reassurance, while the other continually feels the need for distance and freedom. On the surface, it may look like they balance each other, but with time, this balance turns into a psychological tug-of-war. The person with an anxious attachment often makes excessive sacrifices to preserve the relationship. They repeatedly seek explanations, try to understand every behavior, and keep holding on to the hope that maybe tomorrow their partner will change. On the other hand, the avoidant partner perceives closeness as a threat and withdraws. This hide-and-seek can go on for years, where one remains tirelessly invested while the other keeps pulling away. The biggest cost of this ongoing struggle is borne by the anxious partner. They become emotionally drained, lose their self-confidence, and gradually sacrifice their own identity at the altar of the other's moods. As one psychiatrist has said, attachment wounds don't just hurt, they rewire the way we see ourselves and our worth. This truth is what impacts the anxious partner's life the most. But eventually, a moment arrives when the anxious person's survival instinct awakens. Instead of sacrificing everything for love, they decide to safeguard their mental and emotional well-being. This decision may appear sudden, but behind it lies the weight of years of experience and pain, and this is the moment that changes the relationship forever. This transformation is not born in a single moment. It is the result of years of exhaustion and hard-earned lessons. Each choice closes one door but opens another. To understand this shift fully, let us look closely at each point, one by one. The end of explanations. The greatest drain of energy in a relationship occurs when one person keeps offering explanations while the other is neither ready to listen nor willing to understand. In an anxious-avoidant relationship, the anxious partner often finds themselves caught in this struggle. They spend their days and nights thinking about how to express their feelings, how to convey their pain so that the other person might change, or at least take their suffering seriously. It becomes an endless cycle of attempts at dialogue, with questions like, "Why do you keep pulling away? Why does this behavior hurt me so much? Or are you truly present in this relationship?" Research shows that in such dynamics, the anxious partner is often trapped in what can be called an explanation loop. The more they try to clarify and reason, the more defensive and distant the avoidant becomes. This cycle is exhausting. One side pours out energy continuously, while the other side stands like a wall. Experts describe this as being similar to someone knocking on a locked door over and over, hoping it will eventually open, when in reality there may be no one behind it at all. But eventually there comes a moment when the anxious partner falls silent within. They stop arguing, stop explaining. This silence doesn't come from anger but from deep exhaustion and the clarity of truth. They finally realize that all their efforts are not healing the relationship but only wounding themselves, and so they withdraw their energy. This change is unexpected for the avoidant. They are used to the anxious partner always reacting, asking questions, demanding answers, chasing after connection. But for the first time, no questions are asked, no arguments offered, no conversations initiated. This silence itself becomes a decision. As the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, "Once you label me, you negate me." In the same way, the anxious partner eventually sees the truth that being confined to a cycle of doubt and endless explanations is a denial of their very identity. In that moment, they choose to let go of the burden of justification and give priority to their peace. The impact of this decision extends far beyond words. It reshapes the entire structure of the relationship. Where once arguments and explanations held the fragile thread of connection, now a calm silence shifts the balance of power. The anxious partner develops the capacity to live without external validation. This inward shift becomes the foundation of emotional independence. It can be said that when the anxious person stops arguing and explaining, they are in fact freeing themselves from captivity. This silence is not temporary. It is a profound declaration that their worth is no longer tied to someone else's understanding, but to their own peace and identity. Letting go of emotional labor in relationships. The person who takes on more than their share of responsibility often ends up the most exhausted. In the anxious-avoidant dynamic, this role almost always falls on the anxious partner. They don't remain just a companion, they slowly become a therapist, caretaker, and manager of the relationship. Whenever the avoidant withdraws, they double their efforts to fill the gap. When the other stays silent, they keep speaking. When the connection weakens, they pour in all their energy to hold things together. This constant struggle drains them and leaves them hollow inside. Research shows that in such relationships, the anxious partner frequently falls into the caretaking role. They not only provide emotional support, but also carry the weight of the other's fears and insecurities. Over time, this imbalance grows so severe that the relationship stops being a partnership and instead turns into one-sided labor. The biggest cost of this is that the anxious person forgets their personal boundaries and invests energy where nothing is given in return. But eventually, there comes a moment when they stop playing this role. They realize that always being the rescuer is not protecting the relationship, it is only making it more lopsided. With this awareness, they withdraw their emotional labor. Instead of carrying the other's struggles unconditionally, they begin to redirect their energy inward. This shift is not small, it arrives as an inner revolution. According to psychological observations, when the anxious partner pulls back their emotional labor, it's not just a turning point in the relationship, it's the beginning of restoring their own identity. For the first time, they start investing energy into their dreams, interests, and peace of mind. In doing so, they free themselves from the role of the unsung therapist that had drained them for years. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." When the anxious partner stops spending all their strength on someone else's struggles and instead invests in their own purpose and inner peace, that why gives them a new kind of resilience. The results of this decision are striking. Where they once defined themselves around another's needs, they now root their self-worth within themselves. A quiet dignity and calmness begins to shape their behavior. They no longer overextend themselves to keep the relationship alive. Instead, they cultivate balance in their own emotions. It can be said that when the anxious partner lets go of emotional labor, they are not just dropping a burden, they are reclaiming their true identity. This transformation not only strengthens their individual character, but also permanently shifts the balance of the relationship dynamic. The end of pursuit. In every anxious-avoidant relationship, a familiar pattern repeats itself. Whenever the avoidant partner pulls away, the anxious partner steps forward, trying to close the gap. Sometimes this pursuit looks like constant calls and messages, sometimes it shows up as repeated requests for reassurance, and other times it's expressed through silent endurance. Deep down, the anxious partner holds the belief that if they can just move closer, hold on tighter, or explain better, then maybe the other person will return. Experts often describe this as the pursuit-withdrawal cycle. One side distances, the other chases. Over time, this cycle becomes so predictable that both partners' behaviors feel almost scripted. The anxious partner is always working harder, while the avoidant consistently retreats further. The greatest cost of this repetition is that the anxious individual's energy and self-respect slowly erode. But eventually, a shift occurs. The anxious partner stops pursuing. They no longer send the endless texts, no longer bend over backwards to repair the cracks, and no longer throw themselves into saving the connection. This silence is shocking to the avoidant. The person who always chased suddenly stands still. For the first time, the avoidant feels the unsettling truth. Their old tactics no longer hold power. Psychological research suggests that when the anxious partner withdraws from pursuit, the avoidant's entire framework of security is disrupted. Their sense of control has always relied on the expectation that pulling back would trigger their partner to follow. When that response disappears, they are confronted with uncertainty and fear. For the anxious individual, this decision represents an inner breakthrough. They begin to see that pursuit was never truly love. It was a way of keeping their own sense of unworthiness alive. As they stop chasing, they turn their energy inward, focusing on themselves rather than on fixing the unfixable. a new sense of independence and confidence begins to take root. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." The same is true here. Once the anxious partner stops the chase, they are no longer the same person who once ran after love at all costs. They are transformed, someone who no longer ties their worth to another's willingness to stay close. The effects of this shift are profound. The avoidant, once confident that distance guaranteed control, now feels powerless. Meanwhile, the anxious partner begins to reinvest their strength into their own life, their own dreams, and their own peace. In truth, letting go of pursuit is not just a change in behavior, it is a psychological revolution, one that reshapes the dynamic entirely, leaving both partners standing in a reality that can never go back to what it once was. Stopping the excuses. One of the most common ways people try to preserve a relationship is by making excuses for their partner's behavior. In an anxious-avoidant dynamic, this responsibility often falls on the anxious partner. When the avoidant partner withdraws or shows indifference, the anxious individual immediately begins to rationalize it. Maybe they're under pressure at work, maybe they're not feeling well, maybe it's just the wrong time. These excuses may bring temporary comfort, but they blur reality. Psychological observations suggest that when someone continuously justifies their partner's actions, they are, in truth, ignoring their own pain. Over time, this pattern becomes a form of self-deception, where the individual drifts further away from their real needs and emotions. It is much like walking through fog. You can see shapes and outlines, but the clarity of truth remains hidden. But eventually, a moment arrives when the anxious partner stops making excuses. They no longer convince themselves that every dismissive action has a reasonable explanation. Instead, they choose to see the truth as it is. This shift is not easy, because reality is often painful, yet it becomes the first essential step toward establishing clarity and boundaries. According to mental health research, this stage marks a crucial part of the healing process. When someone gives up the habit of excusing poor behavior, they protect themselves from what is known as emotional self-gaslighting, the act of convincing oneself that their pain isn't valid or important. In contrast, facing reality with honesty allows them to honor their own feelings and claim the strength needed to define their limits. The impact of this change on the relationship dynamic is immediate. The avoidant partner suddenly realizes their behavior is no longer being defended. The excuses that once shielded them from accountability vanish. For perhaps the first time, they are confronted with a clear reflection of their own actions. It's as though a mirror has been placed in front of them, showing their flaws in sharp detail. The Greek philosopher Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." This truth applies perfectly here. When the anxious partner stops creating excuses, they examine both the relationship and themselves with honesty. This examination may sting, but without it, genuine growth is impossible. In essence, abandoning excuses is an act of liberation from self-deception. It empowers the anxious partner to set boundaries and to live in alignment with reality rather than illusion. This shift not only brings in a clarity and peace, but also alters the balance of the relationship entirely. By choosing honesty over excuses, the anxious partner steps into a life that reflects truth rather than hope, and in doing so, they find a strength that had been hidden beneath years of rationalization. No longer decoding mixed signals in any unbalanced relationship. The most confusing element is the constant stream of mixed signals. In an anxious-avoidant dynamic, this pattern becomes even more intense. The avoidant partner sometimes moves closer, only to suddenly withdraw. At times they offer small gestures of attention, then quickly retreat into indifference. The anxious partner interprets each of these signals as proof of love, spending endless hours analyzing them. Maybe that smile means they're finally changing, or that one line in the message must reveal their true feelings. This overanalysis becomes an exhausting cycle in which the anxious partner is always searching for hidden clues. Research indicates that when a person continually tries to decipher mixed signals, their nervous system remains in a state of constant alert. This heightened vigilance fuels anxiety and traps the mind on an endless wheel that never stops spinning. Experts explain that such mental labor drains the person of energy that could otherwise be directed toward genuine goals and passions. Instead, it is wasted on questions like, are they distancing themselves because of me, or is it just their nature? Will they come back or not? But eventually the anxious partner reaches a turning point. They stop decoding. They come to realize that these mixed signals are not signs of deep love, but rather reflections of emotional inconsistency. Instead of attaching meaning to every ambiguous gesture, they choose to invest their energy in building their own life. This decision is never easy, but once it is made, it brings a profound sense of clarity and peace. According to psychological observations, when the anxious partner no longer pays attention to mixed signals, their mind begins to free itself from a state of hypervigilance. Rather than constantly scanning for cues, they turn their focus toward personal interests, healthier relationships, and inner calm. This shift nurtures their self-esteem and brings them back into a world that no longer revolves around the avoidance behavior. As the poet Rumi once wrote, "Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open?" This perfectly describes the anxious partner's transformation. By refusing to decode mixed signals, they walk out of the prison of their own making, the prison of false hope and endless overthinking. They finally see that freedom was always available. All it required was the courage to step away. This change shakes the very foundation of the relationship dynamic. The avoidant, who once relied on small gestures to maintain control, finds those tactics ineffective. Meanwhile, the anxious partner reclaims their energy and channels it into their own growth and well-being. In truth, no longer decoding mixed signals is more than a behavioral shift. It is the act of letting go of illusions and standing firmly with reality. It is a return to self, where love is measured not by uncertainty, but by clarity, consistency, and truth. No more sacrifice in every unbalanced relationship. There is often a recurring pattern. One person silences their own needs and desires just to keep the bond intact. In the anxious-avoidant dynamic, this role is usually played by the anxious partner. They put aside personal dreams, interests, and even their happiness, clinging to the hope that such sacrifices might strengthen the relationship. They think, if I give up my comfort, if I suppress my priorities, maybe my partner won't leave me. According to psychological observations, this cycle of constant self-sacrifice is a dangerous trap that slowly disconnects a person from their true identity. When someone repeatedly suppresses their own desires, their sense of self-worth steadily erodes. Deep inside, they begin to believe that their happiness doesn't matter, that only keeping the other person satisfied is important. This imbalance creates a cycle where exhaustion increases while emotional intimacy diminishes. But eventually, the anxious partner reaches a turning point. They stop making these sacrifices. They recognize that no relationship can survive if it is built on the complete erasure of one person's needs. For the first time, they begin to prioritize their own life. They make choices that reflect their interests, give space to their personal dreams, and set clear boundaries. This shift not only brings them inner peace, but also prepares them for healthier relationships in the future. Mental health research suggests that this stage is the root of genuine transformation. When a person stops sacrificing themselves and starts valuing their own needs, even their nervous system begins to heal. Instead of living under constant stress, they move toward balance. Their self-image strengthens, and they become capable of forming connections, but this time on the basis of equality and respect. The Greek philosopher Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." This truth perfectly reflects the anxious partner's realization. By recognizing their own desires and choosing to live by them instead of sacrificing them, they finally begin to live authentically. The effects of this shift are clearly visible in the relationship dynamic as well. The avoidant partner suddenly realizes that the person who once gave up everything now has boundaries and self-respect. On the other side, the anxious partner develops a new sense of confidence. They start to believe that true love does not grow from sacrifice, but from mutual respect. In essence, when the anxious partner stops sacrificing, they are not simply reclaiming their joys, they are redirecting their entire life toward a healthier path. This transformation leads them to a place where they are ready for balanced, fulfilling, and reality-based relationships. Every anxious-avoidant relationship reaches a turning point when the anxious partner finally learns to choose themselves. They let go of everything that once drained them, endless explanations carrying the emotional weight of the relationship, chasing after closeness, making excuses, decoding mixed signals, and sacrificing their own needs. Once these patterns are abandoned, they begin for the very first time to live life on their own terms. This transformation is not just internal, it shakes the very foundation of the relationship dynamic. The avoidant, who always relied on the cycle of pulling away and being pursued, suddenly finds themselves unsettled. Their old strategies no longer work. Silence, mixed signals, or sudden distance no longer provoke the familiar reactions. This indifference acts as a mirror, forcing the avoidant to see their limitations and shortcomings clearly. Meanwhile, the anxious partner stands in a new reality. They establish boundaries, recognize their self-worth, and redirect their energy into their own dreams and peace of mind. They finally understand that love is not defined by sacrifice or suffering, but by respect and balance. As the philosopher Albert Camus once said, freedom is nothing else but a chance to be better. For the anxious partner, this freedom is not merely an escape, it is a beginning. It marks the start of a new chapter where they emerge stronger, wiser, and ready for healthier, authentic connections. In the end, the anxious partner's quiet revolution brings the old dynamic to a close once and for all. What once felt like an endless cycle of pain transforms into the foundation for a conscious, empowered, and hopeful journey forward.